Hello, everybody. One of the issues that we'll be talking about this week is selecting participants for your research study. And so this is actually a really important part of the research process of not only designing a study and figuring out what variables you'll be manipulating and measuring, but then also deciding who you're going to specifically run your experiment on and how you're going to go about selecting participants for your research study. And so that's the issue that we'll really be addressing, at least in part, during this week, along with some other issues. But whenever we talk about selecting participants, one of the things that we need to make sure that everybody understands and is clear on is the issue of populations versus samples. And so whenever we talk about populations and samples, one of the big things to keep in mind is the population is every person in a group of interest. Okay, so for example, if you were interested in studying individuals with Parkinson's disease, the population would be every single individual or person that has Parkinson's disease. If you were interested in the population of American prisoners, then that would be every prisoner in American prison or correctional institution. Okay, so the population is everybody in a particular group of interest. Now, a sample is a subset of people in a population. Okay, so this is a smaller group, and the smaller group are just what the purpose of the smaller group is just to represent the population. Okay, and that is why we use samples. So for example, let's say that we're interested in studying the population of individuals with Parkinson's disease. What we may do is collect a few individuals that have Parkinson's disease that just happen to live around us and have them actually participate in the study. Now this would be a sample of people with Parkinson's disease, and we hope what we learn from the sample is actually what we would be able to apply then or to generalize to the entire population. Similarly, one of the things um, or another example of a sample might be if we're interested in the experiences of prisoners in the United States Correctional Institution. We're not going to test every prisoner at every correctional institution throughout the United States. Instead, we're just going to select a few, maybe a few hundred, from some regional correctional institutionals that then hopefully what we learn from them will actually apply to everybody that's currently in a correctional institute in the United States. Now, a lot of times people have issues or problems remembering the differences between populations and samples. And so one of the analogies that I really like that seems to make sense when thinking about samples is we think about the Flint River that flows through campus. One of the things that the people in the biology department and also the city are doing is they're occasionally taking water samples from the Flint River to try and make generalizations about what's going on. So when they collect these samples, there are very small, specific locations that they take these samples from. And what they do is they just take a sampling of the water running through that location at that moment. Okay, and that's a really good example of a sample. They're not collecting all of the water in the Flint River, which would be the population, but instead they're pulling a single sample. Now, so our Flint River example actually provides a really nice example of not only what a sample is compared to the population of the Flint River, but the other thing that it does is it shows us that you can pick multiple samples. And so one of the things, anytime that you're sampling anything, that can arise is that you sometimes get really good samples and sometimes you get really bad samples. And so that's actually one of the things that we'll be talking about here next. Well, actually, in a second. But whenever we talk about populations, there are really two different types of populations that we need to discuss. One is the target population. Basically, the target population is the population that we're interested in. And these people typically share one characteristic. So in the case of correctional institutions, these people have, or at least spending time in this institution because of a crime that they were proven to have committed. So a population can be everything. It can be everybody with a particular disease, every human being, every college student, whatnot. But the target population is the population it is that we're trying to characterize or that we're trying to make some generalizations about with our research study. And typically that group carries a single characteristic that they all share, whether that's being human or being incarcerated or having a particular disease or whatever the specific characteristic is that we're interested in looking at. Now, the other type of population that you'll hear us talk about a lot is the accessible population. And so this is really who we have access to as researchers. So each researcher's in a given city or location, and there are certain things that are related to being in that region that affect those particular researchers. There are also certain resources that are readily available to them, and other resources that aren't. And so the accessible population is just who it is in our target population that we can gain access to in a convenient manner. So for example, whenever I do a research study looking at individuals with Parkinson's disease, the accessible population are going to be people with Parkinson's disease that are in the area. So Flint, possibly Ann Arbor, Saginaw, and also in Frankenmuth. So that's going to be my accessible population, and they're going to be convenient to look at. If we're doing a study looking at people that have been incarcerated, we might look to some of the local correctional institutions to get our particular accessible population that we're interested in looking at. Now, one of the ideas that comes up, and this is what I was getting at with the water example, one of the ideas that comes up is the representativeness of a sample. And so if you think of this, kind of the way that I typically think of this is, let's say that one of your friends is making chocolate chip cookies or something like that, and they have you sample the dough. I think we've all probably had that experience where it just so happens that the sample that you've decided to take out is a part where maybe the salt in the egg hasn't really mixed too well with the rest of the dough. And so it tastes kind of gross. And your opinion as you make that taste is, well, maybe this isn't actually the best cookie dough that I could have had. These cookies aren't going to turn out bad. Now, what you come to realize later, though, especially if it is a really good batch of cookie dough, is, oh, well, okay, maybe you got a bad sample. Maybe you just happened to hit that one particular area in the cookie dough that things weren't mixed just right and it tasted a little bit funky. Now, that's one of the things that can actually happen whenever we're looking at a sample for a research study. It's a little bit hit or miss of exactly how well our sample represents the actual population. And so we always talk about the representativeness of a sample and how closely we think that it really captures or it mirrors the population that we're interested in looking at. Okay. Now, there are a couple different ways to actually improve the representativeness of a sample. And first is to just try and make sure things are as random as possible, that there's no specific factors that everybody shares, but then also to make sure that you have enough people in your particular sample. Okay, so for example, if we were to look at this class and see how well people are doing in this particular class, we may look at 5 people. And what we can do is average, their total grade, at least at this point in the semester together, and get some sense of what's the average performance of students in this particular class. Now, as you was explaining this, most of you probably thought, well, 5, that's really not enough. This is, a class of about 25 to 30 students. That probably wouldn't be really representative of how the entire class is doing on average. And that's fair to think. And so this is one of the issues that comes up a lot. We're not going to deal with it overly in this class, but one of the things is that you need to find, or you need to make sure that you have enough people in your sample that it actually is representing the population that you're interested in. So for certain things that are common across everybody and everybody seems to do, you can actually get away with having a pretty small number of participants in your research study and still represent the population, especially because people share that commonality and it's so strong in people that you really don't need that many people in order to be able to capture what it is that you're interested in studying. In other cases, there's things that people are really, really variable in. So, not everybody may clearly share this characteristic or this idea, but maybe when you look kind of on average across, a large number of people, you may see that every person actually shows this particular characteristic that you're interested in. In that particular case, you're going to need a really, really big sample of participants. Now, as kind of a general rule of thumb, one of the things that we talk about in psychology is, and one of the questions that you're probably asking yourself now is, well, what's that perfect trade-off? What's that perfect number where you can assume that that your sample matches your population? And the idea here is roughly around 30. Participants seems to be that magic target. Now again, it's going to depend a little bit on what it is that specifically you're interested in. As we look through research studies, you'll notice that some of these, throughout the semester, some of these studies have about 30 participants. Others of them may actually, look at 100, and depending on which articles that we read the semester, some even look at 1,000 people. But in general, 30 seems to be kind of your magic target. And this is based off of an issue that we call the law of large numbers. And basically, as you get closer to 30 participants in your study, then that is going to be what really represents the population as close as possible. So that's the basics of the law of large numbers. The book goes into a little bit more detail and describes it more intact, but that is kind of our magic target whenever we're doing research studies in psychology. Now, another issue that we have to talk about, and we've already alluded to, is the issue of getting a bad sample. And sometimes this just happens by chance. We can't avoid it. It's just nature of probability. But and whenever we get a bad sample, we actually call it a bias sample. And this is a sample that has characteristics that are noticeably different from the population. So just by chance, even though we try to randomly collect participants, or we try to collect participants as randomly as possible, some of them just may be older, better, faster, smarter, whatnot. Okay, and this just, like I keep saying, can happen by chance. We can just pick a bad sample. And so that would actually be a biased sample where we didn't have, even though we tried, just probability-wise, we got a bad group. Now, one of the issues, though, that we have to be careful of is that as experimenters, sometimes we can make bad decisions that actually result in us getting a bad sample because of our doing. Okay, so it doesn't just happen by chance, but actually we make kind of a silly mistake, and in the process of making that silly mistake, we actually create a bad sample for our. Let me talk a little bit and give a really clear definition or explanation of how selection of bias can occur. So again, this is a bias created by the experimenter. They've done something that's kind of unfairly or unduly selected a bad sample of participants. And so probably one of the most historic examples of this is when Dewey and Truman were fighting it out in the presidential election. And newspapers, always want to report, especially back in this time, want to be the first to report what ends up happening. And unfortunately, they didn't have the technological advances that we had, so they were trying to print the paper as soon as possible in order to print all the papers that they needed. And so one of the ideas that the Tribune Review had to, as far as how do we get the paper out as soon as possible, is instead of waiting for the actual election results to come in, they actually decided to survey enough of their readers to try and predict who would win the election based off of what their readers, or who their readers said that they were going to vote for. And this was around the time that the phone was created or invented. And so what they decided to do is, well, why don't we just do a phone survey? So we'll call everybody, see who they're going to vote for. This will give us a sample of the United States that will allow us to predict who's going to win the election. And that's great. What they did was that they found out that, what they found from their results was that more people were going to vote for the Republican Dewey as opposed to Truman. So probably one of the better ways to highlight this is to really give a historical example of when somebody did a research study that they made a silly mistake and it really affected the outcome of their quote-unquote study. So back when Dewey and Truman were running for office, the Tribune Review really wanted to be the first to report who the winner of the election was. And they, because of time constraints of printing the paper and whatnot, they really wanted to get things out as early as possible. And so instead of waiting for the election results, what they decided to do was they decided to sample a population, they decided to sample people throughout the United States and see who they were going to vote for, and kind of do a mini election, if you will, on their own with a small sample of the United States, just to try and figure out who was going to win the election so they could start printing their papers as early as possible. Now, it sounds like a great idea, actually, and they actually had a quick and easy way around this. They couldn't have people in each of the different cities in America, um, you know, asking people who they were going to vote for. That would be really time consuming. And so one idea that they thought is, well, why don't we use this relatively new technology that's been recently invented called the phone? And what we'll do is we'll call people and we'll ask them who they're going to vote for. Now, this is a brilliant idea. It's quick, it's easy, and when they did this particular study, what they found is that most people were going to vote for Dewey. And so they said, okay, great. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and print the paper. We know Dewey's going to win the election when the results come out tomorrow. So we'll go ahead and start printing the paper tonight, and we'll be the first ones to have it ready. And so that's what they did. And lo and behold, what actually ended up happening was that, we've never heard of a President Dewey. Well, we have heard of President Truman. We have this picture here where he's holding up the Dewey defeats Truman sign. And what ended up happening was that actually the Chicago Tribune created a case of selection bias for themselves. Okay, remember that phones at this time were recently invented, and so they weren't very common. Usually, the people that had phones at that time were very prosperous, and usually prosperous people tend to vote along certain party lines. And so, because of using the phones, what they did was they actually set themselves up for an issue of selection bias, and because of that, you can see that their sample of people who were phone owners didn't actually reflect what the entire United States or the population was who they were voting for. Okay, and so you get this awkward picture where the newspaper actually predicted the wrong person. So, looks like I'm missing my slide with the questions about samples and populations, but if you have any questions, definitely feel free to drop me an email and let me know.